Topic 14, Infections of the Human Body, Part 4, Infections of the Urogenital System. Okay, so let's talk about the urogenital system and infections and those body parts. So when we're talking about the urogenital system, we're talking about all of these parts. Of course, there are some different anatomical differences between men and women. Both men and women have urethra, so we're talking about infections of the urethra and also infections of the bladder. And of course, we're also talking about sexually transmitted diseases, so that would involve the vagina and other parts of the genitals, the penis, and related body parts. So what kind of pathogens are we talking about here? A big long list. Sexually transmitted organisms. Of course, we have E. coli on here. We have Staphylococcus on here. Like I said, they seem to be part of every single list of pathogenic organisms. If we look at the female system, we've got E. coli again. Streptococcus is in there as well. Staphylococcus. We've got Candida, so yeast infections, and then all those sexually transmitted infections. Okay, so we're going to start off and talk about urinary tract infections, or UTIs. And of course, there's several parts there, and depending on what part of the urinary tract the infection is found, can lead to different complications and pain and those kind of things. The lower urinary tract infections include the urethra and the bladder. Very common. Often they will pass on their own. Sometimes treatment is needed. Sometimes it can be extremely painful. Sometimes maybe not so much. You can see there are different names for this. Urethritis for a urethra infection is the most common. Cystitis for bladder infection. Upper urinary tract infections include the kidneys, less common, more painful, and can be quite serious, particularly if it spreads to the blood. Of course, we have sexually transmitted infections and sexually transmitted diseases. We're often using STI nowadays a lot more than we're using STD. And the reason for that is that many sexually transmitted diseases are asymptomatic. So a person doesn't necessarily have symptoms or a disease, but they may indeed be infectious. So it's important to distinguish that. So let's talk about urinary tract infections. The big culprit here is E. coli. So we've talked a lot about E. coli this semester. E. coli, of course, is a fecal organism, and this is a scenario of where E. coli has basically found itself in the wrong anatomical place. We're going to talk about sexually transmitted infections. Mostly we're going to talk about chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis. They're kind of the number 1, 2, and 3 sexually transmitted infections in Canada. So we'll get to those in a minute. So let's talk about urinary tract infections. Here is the general trend. You can see in young people, so maybe ages 0 to 3 before there's any toilet training, it's relatively similar. Girls and boys have very similar amounts of urinary tract infections. After that, it's mostly girls and women who are getting urinary tract infections. I believe we talked about this in class already. This has a lot to do with the female anatomy. The anus and the urethra are very close to one another compared to males, and there is also a lot of bacteria that can be transmitted through the vagina as well. And so it's very important for girls to be taught proper sanitary habits. So for example, the direction in which to wipe after going number 2, and also careful sexual practices. And by that I mean it is women are advised to urinate after having sexual intercourse in order to help clear the urethra in case any bacteria got in the urethral entrance during sexual intercourse. You can see over here, once people start to age, it starts to become men who become a little bit more susceptible to urinary tract infections. And probably the bigger number 1 reason is men in nursing homes and quite honestly adult diapers. This is leading to just a lot easier for those fecal pathogens to make it to the male urethra at the tip of the penis. So what are some common bacterial causes? We mentioned E. coli is probably the number 1 cause. Certain types of pathogenic E. coli have the right pili to attach to bladder cells. There's actually not a lot of E. coli that can do this, but this is why some people rarely get bladder infections and some people get reoccurring bladder infections. You can see we also have Proteus and Klebsiella, and then there's Pseudomonas aeruginosa on this list. So I'm just circling those two because those are organisms that we talked about. By the way, all four of these organisms here are gram-negative rods. That's why I have them in red font. There are some gram-positives. So for gram-positives, we have Enterococcus and there's Staphylococcus. So both of these are gram-positive cocci. But Staphylococcus aureus, of course, is an important pathogen, like I said, for many, many body systems. So what can we say about urinary tract infection symptoms? Sometimes they can be mild, sometimes they can be severe. Usually it has something to do with urination. There can be pain or discharges during urination. If the urinary tract infection is a little bit higher up in the system, can lead to fever, and like I said, the risk is of course blood infections. So prevention, hygiene mostly, careful sexual practices, like I said, teaching girls which direction to wipe, and having a good practice of people urinating after having sexual intercourse. So treatment, if it's E. coli, a good percentage of E. colis are resistant to penicillins. So often the treatment of choice are the quinolones, the fluoroquinolones, or sometimes erythromycin. Again, it may depend on resistance, and of course, in this case, often there's kind of doctors often have a lot of choice or preference in terms of treating these kind of infections. Sometimes a urine sample may actually help to figure out what organism it is and determine the route of treatment. So one other thing that we have talked about as well this semester is that, of course, anytime you take antibiotics, there's this issue here, is that the antibiotics may actually do something to a person's normal flora. In this case, we're talking about the flora of women in their vagina, may kill the lactobacillus in there, and this may actually give the chance of a reinfection, or may actually lead to a yeast infection after having these antibiotics, because yeast, of course, are not killed by antibiotics because they are fungi. So let's talk a little bit about sexually transmitted infections. These are all bacterial infections I'm going to start to talk about. The number one sexually transmitted infection in Canada is chlamydia. And here are some posters I saw. I took some photos of them, and you may notice it's talking about, it says here, chlamydia may be the last thing you carry. In terms of it's talking about the fact that sometimes chlamydia causes fertility complications. So I don't know if anyone here is from Saskatchewan or Regina in particular. I have something interesting to show you. This here. So this here actually was a few years ago. You can see the date 2007. Regina was the chlamydia capital of Canada. And so public health in Regina figured maybe the best way to deal with this, because nobody wants to be the chlamydia capital of Canada, was to see if they could get a lot of people tested. So they had a public advertisement campaign. So here's a billboard. You can see they're saying just go get a urine test. Here's a bus. Apparently these were all over the place. I've never lived in Regina, so I never did see these billboards, but I'd be curious if anybody remembers these. So what can we say about chlamydia? Chlamydia is an intracellular pathogen. So what does that mean? It means it lives inside cells. In fact, when chlamydia was first discovered, it was thought it was actually a virus because its life cycle looks a little bit like a viral life cycle. It's living inside a cell, and it can't actually live in a culture. To this day, we still can't culture chlamydia. So here's the big thing about chlamydia. You can see it says here it's asymptomatic in the majority of individuals. So that means there are a lot of people out there who have chlamydia and they don't know it, and they are carriers, and they can transmit it to sexual partners. A very high percentage. This is why it is the number one sexually transmitted infection in Canada. What else about chlamydia? So symptoms, as with a lot of sexually transmitted infections, can include symptoms that look a lot like urinary tract infections. So people may have pain or discharges during urination. In women and men, there may be other discharges around their sexual organs as well. Take a look at these notes here. It says in women and in men, this may spread a little deeper and may cause infertility issues. So this is a major cause of infertility amongst Canadian men and women, partly because they had the disease and didn't know they had it and did not get treated in time. You can see that it is associated with other diseases such as arthritis, and there are some infections that do get into babies when they're born and can cause vision loss. So how do we diagnose chlamydia? As you saw in those posters, it's a urine test, and the urine test, we can't culture it, so the test actually is looking for DNA of chlamydia, so it's a PCR test. It's a pretty simple test, very routine nowadays, and the treatment as well is also relatively routine. Typically, it's one dose of this particular antibiotic here. It's called azithromycin, so that's a macrolide antibiotic. Remember what a macrolide is? Macrolides are antibiotics that they bind ribosomes. R-I-B-O-SOME. There you go. So the number 2 sexually transmitted infection in Canada is gonorrhea, and you'll see there's a lot of similarities with gonorrhea and chlamydia in that a high percentage of individuals, it says right here, are asymptomatic. So again, that's a problem with transmission. People can have it, they don't know they have it, and they're spreading it to sexual partners. So this here we've talked about a number of times is a gram-negative diplococci, and it is the one of 2 Neisseria that we talked about, the other Neisseria being Neisseria meningitidis. This is Neisseria gonorrhea, so it's a sexually transmitted infection, of course. So symptoms, again, we're looking at discharges, painful urination, both in males and females. There may be some pain during intercourse, there may be other discharges, and sometimes cramps. So again, here's another sexually transmitted infection that can lead to sterility in both sexes. And it can also affect newborns. So if you do get pregnant and you have a baby, one of the things they will do at the hospital is they will administer antibiotics to your baby's eyes shortly after it's born. And the traditional reason why this was done is actually because of gonorrhea. Even if you don't have gonorrhea, they still give it as a precautionary measure to prevent a lot of eye infections that can cause issues. But blindness from gonorrhea was the number 1 reason why it was traditionally administered. So gonorrhea traditionally is very easily treatable by penicillins. Unfortunately, gonorrhea is also very good at obtaining resistance. So there's a lot more resistant strains out in the wild nowadays, and so it may require a second antibiotic if it doesn't clear up within a week or 2 after treatment. So I want to talk about syphilis just for a short amount of time. It is basically probably the number 3 sexually transmitted infection in Canada. I think that number varies depending on the data you're looking at. It's a very complex disease, so I didn't want to cover it in a lot of detail. But here's the name of the organism that causes syphilis. It's called Treponema pallidum, and it's a spirochete, so it's a corkscrew-shaped organism. So here's the main thing I want you to know about it, besides the fact that it is a corkscrew-named organism, is that it can be transmitted to the fetus. So this is during pregnancy, not during childbirth. So this can be actually quite serious to the unborn fetus. Some other things to know about it is that the symptoms actually change. This is why it's called the great imitator. The symptoms change and they look like other diseases as it progresses. So it starts out as a sexually transmitted infection. So we're looking at genital sores and things like that from the sexual contact. It eventually spreads to other tissues, which can lead to other symptoms. You can see rashes, fever, sore throat, those kind of things. And if somebody has syphilis for years, you can see you're looking at all sorts of other damage to other tissues, such as dementia. People used to talk about syphilis of the brain before there was ever a treatment for syphilis, and this was because syphilis was getting into the brain from spreading there. So I want to talk about some other sexually transmitted infections. Mostly we're going to talk about viruses and protists and things like that. Just a reminder of some of the things we talked about. So we did talk about genital herpes. Remember, that's herpes simplex 2. usually. Sometimes herpes simplex 1, which is usually causing our cold sores. This is a lifelong infection because it's a herpes virus. Can be mediated or controlled by various antivirals such as Herpex, which is, you can see the main name of this, which is aciclovir, I think is how you pronounce that. We also talked about genital warts. So genital warts are caused by HPV, human papillomavirus. This is a different virus. It's causing warts. Not just genital warts, but warts of any part of the body. There's about 200 strains. I think about 30 strains are associated with genital warts, so they're sexually transmitted. And there are a small handful of strains, about 9 of them in particular, that are highly associated with cervical cancer. The good news is there are vaccines. We're using Gardasil for the most part in Canada, and that is actually vaccinating people against 9 different strains of the HPV virus. So here's a note. This is very highly spread amongst Canadians and people worldwide. It's estimated anywhere from 50 to 75% of people will get HPV at some point in their lifetime. They may not get symptoms, they may not get cancer, but they will get one of the strains. Like I said, there's about 170 or 200 strains or something like that. So there are fungal infections of the urogenital system. Mostly we're talking about yeast, which is Candida albicans. So we've talked about that a little bit already. I'm going to move on from that. Often people get yeast infections after having antibiotics or some other thing that has messed around with their natural bacterial flora. You can see this slide here. It's showing the lactobacilli, and the lactobacilli, if they're killed off by antibiotics, the yeast get a chance to grow up. So what about protist infections? I know what you're thinking. What could that be? Well, there's one protist infection, Trichomonas. So Trichomonas vaginalis. That may be the most common protist infection of the industrialized world. We're not getting a lot of other parasites. And again, we have a huge amount of people that are asymptomatic. You can see in my note here, males are rarely symptomatic. So it's very easy to be spread amongst people if people are not having any symptoms. So pretty similar to chlamydia and gonorrhea, discharges sometimes painfully during urination. I'm not entirely sure whether this one can cause sterility amongst the genders or not. I'd have to look that one up. There are some rare cases where it is spread from mother to daughter during childbirth, but that's extremely rare. So there is one other parasite we did talk about as a sexually transmitted infection, and that is pubic lice, and something that is of the 3 types of lice that is spread because it attaches itself to pubic hair. So that is the end of part 4 for infections of the human body. So infections of the human body, part 5, infections of the nervous system. So one important infection of the nervous system is meningitis. So what is meningitis? Meningitis is an inflammation of the meninges. So what are the meninges? Meninges are membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord. You can see there's some notes here about the cranial meninges and the spinal meninges. They're just those membranes that are surrounding that nervous tissue. When they get inflamed, it can lead to a variety of symptoms. So you can see the symptoms include vomiting, fever, pain in the joints, headache, stiff neck, disorientation, sometimes rashes. That's interesting. And in severe cases, coma. So what is the cause of meningitis? Turns out there are many, many causes. As long as a bacteria or virus can get in there and affect those tissues and cause inflammation, it can cause meningitis. So bacterial causes, you can see over 50 species, but notice we have E. coli there. We have Staphylococcus. Other organisms, we've got Streptococcus. We've got Neisseria meningitidis, Haemophilus influenza. We haven't really covered this organism in this class, and it's just one of those organisms that we just didn't have time to really get around to. So I don't want you to worry about that one, but notice it says 70% of cases are all these 3. So Streptococcus, Neisseria, Haemophilus. E. coli, Staphylococcus aureus, and Listerius are also part of that group. So usually what happens when there's a suspicion of meningitis, bacteria are cultured from a spinal tap, and then based on which bacteria it is, they will choose the antibiotic. We can also get viral meningitis. Again, there are many different viruses that can cause different types of meningitis. You can see here it says 90% are caused by enteroviruses. And we're not going to get into what that means, but there are also herpes viruses and mumps viruses. And of course, since these are viral infections, we don't have a lot of antivirals, so there's not really a specific treatment. They may try antivirals, usually they're treating the symptoms and not the cause. So let's talk about bacterial infections in the nervous system. Mostly this is just a bit of review of some things that we've talked about in other courses. So we have talked about botulism and we talked about tetanus. So both of these organisms are gram-positive spore formers. There are some pictures of them forming endospores, and both of them are neurotoxins. So if you remember that botulism has a neurotoxin that causes paralysis, and tetanus has a neurotoxin that does the exact opposite. It forms, it makes muscles lock up and they can't relax. There are also viral infections of the nervous system that we covered in this course. A big one that's important worldwide, not as important in Canada, is because it's been eradicated in Canada, is of course polio. Normally it infects the gastrointestinal system, but in a small percentage of cases it does cause various types of spasms and paralysis. About 2% or less of all cases. Thankfully, we have at least 2 effective vaccines against polio, and maybe someday it will be eradicated worldwide. So we talked about meningitis, and it's also worth it to mention encephalitis. So encephalitis is swelling of the brain. So that can be very dangerous, particularly more dangerous in adults because our brain bones are fused together and the brain has nowhere to swell. Encephalitis tends to not be as dangerous in children, particularly if their portions of the skull are not fused yet together. They have room for the swelling to occur. The older you get, the more serious encephalitis can be. So several causes of encephalitis. We've talked about rabies. So rabies, of course, is spread from animals typically, and you can see in that case there's a rabid dog biting someone, and the virus gets spread through the nerves. If you do get bitten in the foot, it's about 2 weeks before it gets from your leg to your brain. So if you get a rabies vaccine within that time, your body has plenty of time to mount an immune response against the virus. We also talked about West Nile virus. I'll talk about it in a moment. We also talked about the trypanosomes, so that includes African sleeping sickness and Chagas disease. And we talked about prions. I think I have a slide for each of these. So rabies, there's rabies, often fatal if not treated, and comes from wild animals. West Nile virus, also from wild animals. The reservoir for West Nile virus is birds, and it is spread by mosquitoes. So humans are an accidental host when the mosquitoes can't find bird hosts and they're extra hungry, and usually it leads to flu-like symptoms. In some cases you're looking at encephalitis, and particularly in older people this can be fatal. If physicians know what to look for, we can treat the encephalitis with some steroids, reduce the inflammation, and it's rarely fatal nowadays. So parasite infections of the nervous system. So one significant important parasite infection worldwide is the pork tapeworm. I can't remember the numbers, but I think about 50 million people worldwide suffer from neurocysticercosis. So neuro means nervous system, of course. Cyst means cyst. So we have a cyst in our nervous system. So if you take a look on the left, this is the typical life cycle of the pork tapeworm. You can see here we've got the adult tapeworm in the human. We've got eggs being released over here. The pig eats the eggs hatch in the pig, and the little larvae, you can see the little larvae are all over the pig in various tissues. If they're in the muscle tissue, not a big deal. If they end up in the brain, it can be quite serious. The human over here is eating the cooked pork, or the undercooked pork, and therefore the tapeworm has a chance to grow. So in that case, if you have the adult tapeworm, it's not really too serious. Often people won't even have symptoms other than little segments of the worm in their stool. The serious part of this disease is when the person eats eggs. So often they will self-infect themselves due to poor sanitary habits, and they eat the eggs, and now those eggs end up in the human, and you can see here they're hatching and turning into larvae and growing all over the body. So if they end up in the muscle tissues, not too serious unless there's lots of them. If they end up in the brain, this can be quite serious and cause all sorts of issues. So this is neurocysticercosis. There's a picture of somebody's brain. You can see right here they have that tapeworm larva in their brain. So we talked about one prion all semester. I'll refresh you in a moment. The term for prion diseases is spongiform, so spongy brain. And the prion we talked about was this one here, the prion that causes Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So it also causes mad cow disease in cattle and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. So this is transmitted to humans who eat the brain or spinal cord of infected carcasses. So it's pretty rare in Canada, slightly more common in the UK, and due to changes in slaughterhouse practices, hopefully this disease will actually disappear. So part 6 is infections of the circulatory system and systemic infections. Unfortunately, I really don't have time this semester to give this particular unit any justice. There's a lot that could be said about systemic infections. What do we mean by systemic infections? We mean infections of the blood. If we're talking about bacteria, we might say bacteremia. If we're talking about viruses, we might say viremia, and so on. And the big issue with bacteremia is this may lead to sepsis or septic shock. So remember what that means. It means the immune system recognizes something in the blood that is not human and mounts an immune response. So we're looking at fever, extreme low blood pressure, and in some cases, in extreme cases, we're looking at things like organ failure, which can be very, very serious. So what pathogens are we talking about? Pretty much the normal list. You can see we have Staphylococcus here. We have our two main Streptococcus strains. We've got Neisseria meningitidis, and we've got E. coli. So again, all the usual suspects once again. Although this list can be much, much longer, there are many bacteria that can indeed infect the blood. We could include plague on this list. Oh, there's plague right there. So our little reminder about plague. Plague is a disease that is in rodents, and it is spread by fleas. So rodents are the reservoir, fleas are the vector. This is a gram-negative rod, very similar to E. coli, called Yersinia pestis. Another bacteria of the blood which is becoming more and more common in Canada is Lyme disease. And Lyme disease is spread not by an insect, but spread by a tick. So remember the differences between a tick and an insect is a tick has 8 legs, an insect has 6 legs. So the reservoir of Lyme disease is mice and deer in the wild. Mice are probably more significant than the deer, and this is spread by a tick called the black-legged tick. You can see here you have two versions. The one on the left is the male, and the one on the right is the female. And the ones we have to be really concerned about are very tiny, about the size of a poppy seed. So there's a viral infection of the circulatory system that's very important. This is the one that causes mono or infectious mononucleosis. This is the Epstein-Barr virus. So again, this is a human herpes virus. So this is a lifelong infection, although people usually only get it once. So this infects the actual lymphatic system, and so generally when people get infected, they get swollen lymph nodes. So you can see in this picture here, it's showing some swollen lymph nodes. This leads to lots of other symptoms such as extreme fatigue and fever, sometimes a sore throat and things like that. There is no direct treatment for this other than treating the symptoms. Most people have this by the time they're age 30. They've had it one way or another. One thing about infectious mononucleosis is that most of us in Canada fall into these categories here. So you can see here, it says here if we have a normal or vigorous immune system, we can be asymptomatic, or we can end up with symptoms of infectious mononucleosis. So a lot of people have had it, they don't know it, or they've had it, and well, I had it in grade 10 and I remember it very, very clearly. Unfortunately, people down at this end of the spectrum with their immune system that's weak, it can actually lead to various types of cancers, such as Burkitt's lymphoma and a couple of other different types of cancers. So what about protozoan infections of the circulatory system? We are talking about malaria as being probably the most significant protozoan infection on the planet. This is caused by the Plasmodium species. Don't forget that name, Plasmodium. This is spread by the Anopheles mosquitoes in many tropical climates. We also talked about the trypanosomes, so that includes both Chagas disease and African sleeping sickness, and these are spread by various insects that are found geographically. So Chagas disease, you can see on the left, is spread by those kissing bugs, and those kissing bugs, thankfully, are not found in Canada. So this is almost the end. I just wanted to show you where you can get these giant microbes from. These are these little stuffed animal microbes that I have a few of, and I have brought them to class. You can get them here from giantmicrobes.com, or you can get them So this is it. This is the end. We are at the last slide in all of my notes. I want to wish everybody here a good luck on your final exam. Thanks for taking my class. I hope you enjoyed all the conversations. Unfortunately, they have not been quite as good over the internet as opposed to in person. I will be in touch with everybody regarding the final exam, what to expect. Please do be in contact with me if you have any questions. I hope you enjoyed the class. If you have any future microbiology questions, please come and talk to me or send me an email. Let me know how you're doing. I'd love to hear any microbiology stories that you have in your hospital settings when you go on placements or practicums, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have in the future. So best of luck to you all. I hope you do well and keep healthy during this pandemic, and I will hopefully see you around the college in the future. Take care always.